Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host, Khalid. But today is the 16th of February 2022, and we'll be discussing the following during the course of the show. We'll begin, ladies and gentlemen, with the situation in Afghanistan, the humanitarian crisis, the economic crisis that is engulfing the country, and of course, Pakistan's stance against it. Pakistan has been talking on different fora as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Our Prime Minister has talked on different media channels, important media channels, the latest being the CNN, and he has talked about the plight of the Afghan people. At the same time, there's also the reaction that has come from the United States of America. They are unfreezing $3.5 billion of the $7 billion in the Afghan central bank. What kind of repercussions is this going to have? Because there's a lot of negative reaction. And when will that money actually reach Afghanistan? That is going to be our first segment. Our second story, ladies and gentlemen, concerns the latest situation as far as Ukraine is concerned. Now, Russia says on Wednesday, and I quote, that the military drills in Moscow and next Crimea have ended and that soldiers are returning to their garrisons. Now, if that is happening, that means a de-escalation of the military troops that had gone above 100,000 along with Belarus in the military drills. But the United States and the United Kingdom do not agree to that. How far will that go as far as the untangling of this strategic tension is concerned? This is going to be our second story. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to talk about World Health Organization that has congratulated Pakistan for administering 200 million COVID-19 vaccines across Pakistan. And of course, the NCOC, Dr. Faisal Sultan, and the health care workers need to be lauded for that. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, we'll talk about Dr. Yasir Siddique's led team, whose invention has set 2 world records in solar cell technology. Another innovation coming from a Pakistani scientist. Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin with our first story, and that concerns what is happening in Afghanistan, how diligently Pakistan has been working towards the Afghan cause, and what are the latest statements that have emanated from the US in this regard. More in the following report.
The unfolding humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan poses substantial threat to regional stability. Pakistan has been urging the world not to abandon Afghanistan, unfreeze its assets and ensure the delivery of aid and assistance to the war-ravaged country that is embroiled in a humanitarian crisis. U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan Tom West, speaking at United States Institute for Peace, acknowledged significance of Pakistan in the future trajectory of post-U.S. Afghanistan. Underlining the importance of multilateral diplomacy and untangling Afghan Quagmire, Tom West emphasized the importance of Troika Plus in regional diplomacy in Afghanistan. Premier Imran Khan has been reiterating the country's long-standing policy that Pakistan could be partners with the United States in peace but never in conflict.
After having lost 80,000 people now, Pakistan cannot afford another conflict. So we will be partners in peace with the US, but not in conflict.
Underscoring pragmatic regional approach, Prime Minister Imran Khan, in an exclusive interview with the CNN's Fareed Zakaria, emphasized that Afghanistan is on the verge of experiencing the worst humanitarian crisis and urged engagement with interim Afghan Taliban government. It's pertinent to mention here that Pakistan and US have same interests in Afghanistan, that is, political settlement, stability, economic development, and denial of any haven for the terrorists.
Right now, we have shared aim with the US. We want no terrorism from Afghanistan. We are against international terrorism. So is the US. So we have a shared interest. And I hope that US also realizes that, they originally came to Afghanistan to fight international terrorism. And now if it goes into chaos, you could end up the same position again. So therefore, we have a shared interest for stability in Afghanistan.
U.S. President Joe Biden's decision to divert half of the frozen Afghan central bank funds held in U.S. to the families of 9/11 victims will further exacerbate the plight of Afghans. They are facing grave economic and humanitarian challenges, and the international community must play its important and constructive role in alleviating their sufferings.
To talk about Afghanistan, the crisis that has emanated since quite some time, and the reaction that is coming from the world bodies as a result of the unfreezing of the $3.7 billion for the Afghans. Of course, this is Afghan money. We've been joined by Muneeb Qadir. He's a political analyst. Muneeb, thank you very much to have joined us on this show. Muneeb, tell us first of all, the reaction that has emanated from the US as far as the unfreezing of 3.7 billion US dollars and the reaction that also came from the world and from Afghanistan, how do you take it? Do you feel that the US is going to change its policy as far as the rest of the 3.7 billion is concerned, or is it going to continue in the same vein?
First of all, let me comment on the international reaction that this unfreezing of Afghan assets has generated from among various NGOs or even world leaders across the globe. Interestingly, I was just reading David Miliband, who was the Foreign Secretary of the UK, and he has said that releasing only 3.5 billion out of Afghan frozen assets from US Central Bank and allocating only that amount to the Afghan civilians, whilst you are retaining 3.5 billion dollar further for your own 9/11 victims. That just feels punitive and unjust, and you are trying to hold those people accountable for 9/11 and for all that has happened between the US and Afghan Taliban. Those who had no say in anything, those who are themselves victims, those who were not even perhaps born, because that was more than 20 years ago. And 9/11 has nothing to do with Afghan civilians. They themselves have suffered the most. So to release only $3.5 billion and allocate only that to alleviate whatever hunger and deprivation and poverty can be alleviated or those concerns addressed towards Afghan civilians, I think that is very punitive. And I'm not on a very different page from, for example, what Antonio Guterres has said, or what, like I've just said, David Miliband has said, and various NGOs across the globe have said. And there's a reason why the British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has just announced that next month Britain is intending to co-host an Afghanistan aid summit with the UN, hoping to raise around $4.4 billion for Afghan civilians, because 90%, more than 90% of the population is living below poverty line. Nearly 40 million
now,
people.
Muneeb, you talk about the Afghans that are living below the poverty line. I agree with that. We all know that. We have all been talking about the plight of the Afghan people. The United Nations also pledged for the Afghan people. What came out of that? Has any money from the United Nations reached? Because we did know that some of the countries did pledge for Afghanistan. Any result of that? Did the money trickle out into Afghanistan? What's your take on that as well?
When the same United Nations has estimated that 98% of Afghans are not eating enough and hospitals and schools cannot afford to pay staff, I mean, it's self-evident that nothing has come to the aid, to the rescue of Afghan civilians. And there's a reason why Britain is hosting a fundraising summit along with the UN, projecting like around $4.4 billion. There's a reason why all of that is happening, because there is nothing that has come to the relief of common Afghan men, women, and children. And this is a dire situation that they find themselves in for no fault of their own.
All right, Muneeb, about the 3.5 billion US dollars. How long do you feel it will take for the money to actually reach Afghanistan and the Afghan people, in fact?
I think that's a very valid question. And we have to keep in mind the fact that the UN, that the Western world, of course, pioneered by the United States, they are very much concerned that whatever amount that they're unfreezing, this $3.5 billion, it just doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And that is a concern. And by wrong hands, they mean, that they do not trust the Taliban regime, which has been installed post 15th August in Afghanistan. They are not assured of the promises, of the assurances that the Taliban regime has given up until now. They haven't recognized the Taliban government, and they find themselves in this quagmire, America and the United Nations and the Western Bloc, that how do we address criticisms that are being directed at us for not providing humanitarian relief to Afghan civilians, whilst at the same time ensuring that we do not end up rewarding the Taliban regime, that the money does not fall into the hands of those whom the Western Bloc does not inherently trust. They keep in mind the fact that between 1996 to 2001, the Taliban regime that was there did not perform very good according to Western standards on women's rights, on human rights, or when it came to dissenters. They somehow need more assurances. before they even recognize the legitimacy of the Taliban government. So how exactly to reconciliate these two completely conflicting aims? One, on the one hand, the Western Bloc wants to not recognize the Taliban government, does not want them to get any of the Western money. And on the other hand, it is their responsibility, and it is the responsibility of the international community, which is very well enshrined in the
I totally agree with
very
you on that,
United
Muneeb.
Nations Charter.
Here, in this whole quagmire comes a reaction from the Taliban. The statement that has been signed by Deputy Spokesperson Imamullah Samangani, who talks about Taliban that will reconsider their policy towards the US if the assets are not freed. Now, I understand that there is a lot of anger within Afghanistan, also within the Afghan people and the Taliban as well. Do you fear that there is going to be a change in the Afghan Taliban or the Afghan general attitudes towards the US if the aid does not reach in time? Forget the 7 billion, even if this 3.5 billion does not reach within, say, the next week or 2 weeks.
Now, these are the logistics which need to be worked out. Some months ago, there was news that the money is going to reach Afghanistan, but it is going to be given to either the civil society sector, to NGOs. But on the other hand, NGOs are not very well trusted by the Taliban. What exactly are the channels through which this money is going to reach Afghanistan for the relief of Afghan civilians? These logistics have not been worked out. There's just been a broad announcement by the Biden administration. But how exactly is that going to be realized? Nothing. Absolutely nothing has been agreed. No logistics have been announced. How that is going to work out. And there is such high level of mistrust on all the sides. And let me tell you that even Afghan civilians, whilst, a lot of them, we saw what happened in August 2021 when they were trying to flee away from Afghanistan. Afghan civilians, a huge section of them, might not trust the current regime that they have in Afghanistan itself, but they've also lost a lot of faith in America. Just the fact that in September 2021, US airstrikes killed 10 Afghan civilians in Kabul, and then later the Pentagon chief absolved the US of any liability whatsoever, saying that it was just a mistake. That doesn't inspire a lot of confidence among Afghan civilians towards the US, towards the seriousness of even the United Nations, which is very much steered in accordance with the US policy. So given this mistrust, the point is who is suffering the most? It is Afghan people. At the hands of terrorism, at the hands of persecution.
But Muneeb, haven't the Afghan people always suffered? Since the last 4 decades, aren't the Afghan people the ones that are suffering the most? Leave aside the higher ups or the elite or the government officials. Which brings me to another point, and that is the US side of the whole story. I'd like to quote what Tom West said at the United Nations Institute of Peace. And I'll take one by one the quotes and I'll ask your point of view about it. He says, "We don't have a choice but to work with Pakistan on the path ahead as far as Afghanistan is concerned." Is this a realization that has just come to the United States of America, or are they making it open as far as their policy towards Pakistan and Afghanistan is concerned now?
I don't believe that this is something new or that this realization has just dawned upon the US administration. In fact, the previous Trump administration quite well knew that Pakistan did have leverage over the Taliban and that they could play a constructive role in reinstating peace in
We
Afghanistan.
do remember in the Trump era, Muneeb, as well, that it was Donald Trump that asked Pakistan to initiate the contact between the Afghan Taliban and the then Afghan government as well. And Pakistan, of course, reciprocated.
Pakistan had a huge role in the Doha talks, and I remember that in 2019, the Doha talks were very active. And even at that time, the Trump administration was concerned with ending that more than 20 years war, which had started in Afghanistan since 2001. So that realization has always been there. So when someone from the US administration or someone at the very political heart of the US establishment says that we need to count upon Pakistan, that comes as no surprise. They've already known that.
All right, Muneeb, another quote, and that concerns the Afghan aid of $3.5 billion US. And I'll refer again to Tom West, who says that the US hasn't made a judgment that the $3.5 billion taken out of the $7 billion in Afghan assets will be used for humanitarian assistance and the United Nations. He said he left the possibility open that it could instead be used for future recapitalization of the Afghan central bank. Is that going to help the Afghans?
Right now, anything is going to help. The question is, when they quote these figures that, these many $billion are going to be released and this much amount is going to be allocated to alleviating the hardships that are being endured by Afghan civilians. The question is that are these only words, or are they going to follow the
When
same
is it
with
going to be
deeds?
translated into action? That is the key question at this point that everybody is asking. The third point that he said, and I'd quote him again, he said that the US is not supporting any armed opposition or group against the Taliban. And he said we would discourage other powers from doing so as well. What is your comment on that?
The whole raison d'etre, the whole purpose for the Doha talks, which eventually led to the retreat of American soldiers, and why American soldiers and American troops had left Afghanistan, was that they wanted peace with the Afghan Taliban. Now, if they are saying that they would that they do not support any military action anymore on Afghan soil, and they have also taken assurances from the Taliban will make sure that any threat emanating from Afghan soil never comes to fruition. That that the Afghan Taliban gets to control organizations like the new IS Khorasan or ISK as it is known, and to make sure that Afghan soil is not used as a base for launching attacks on other countries. As far as those commitments are honored on each and every side, perhaps there's a lot that one could count on, that there might be peace. But at the same time, the threat to peace is the fact that there is anger, I believe, which is being generated among Afghan civilians. There is all this mistrust, this constant mistrust on both the sides of Afghan Taliban versus United States. They might be, trying to restore diplomatic relations to an extent, but the fact that the Afghan Taliban regime has not been officially recognized by any country in the world, I think that is a major stumbling block. And
but in this whole scenario, also, as you just said, that there no country in the world is accepting the Afghan Taliban government, because there are some preconditions that have been put forward that have, as per the West, not yet been met by the Afghan government. Where does that leave this whole relationship of Afghanistan with the rest of the world? How is Afghanistan going to move forward if there is no diplomatic resolution of this issue?
What's most worrisome is that fine, Afghan Taliban have come into power. They are, we look at the de facto situation, they are the ones who have installed their regime. But the question is, what health policy, what economic policy, what defense policy, what have Afghan Taliban to offer to the common Afghan civilian, Afghan men, women, and children?
But Muneeb, they need to get money in order to kind of reinforce other sections of their government. If they don't have the money to do anything, how will they move forward?
That's correct. But how are they going to address the concerns of the Western Bloc? And at the same time, how is the Western Bloc going to address concerns of Afghan civilians? Because the point is that even if the Western Bloc, they do not trust the Afghan Taliban regime, because I understand, we cannot set a precedent where, a new regime is installed on the sheer strength of force. There needs to be an electoral mandate before any regime can claim legitimacy to govern. I understand that. And there's a Montevideo Convention as well of 1933, which gives the criteria for statehood or recognizing a government. I understand all of that. But, the thing is that if the Western Bloc is so concerned about human rights in Afghanistan, they should also start with themselves. I remember that the Trump administration penalized Fatou Bensouda, who was the ICC prosecutor, when she tried to open investigations into the drone strikes from America on Afghan civilians. And so the thing is that if you are talking about human rights, you need to hold yourselves accountable as well. Because unfortunately, I believe that, Afghan civilians have suffered from all quarters. And it is they who should be at the center of every single talk. And women's rights, minority rights, journalists, anyone who is a dissenter. What are they getting a say? Are their voices being heard? Ultimately, that should be the focus.
That is so true, Muneeb, and thank you very much to have joined us on this very important segment that is, of course, Afghanistan and the latest situation. And we'll continue talking to you on this and many other issues. Thank you very much to have joined us. This was Muhammad Muneeb Qadir, political analyst, talking to us about the latest situation in Afghanistan. All eyes are on the humanitarian aid and the humanitarian situation as far as Afghanistan is concerned. When will that $3.5 billion actually reach the Afghan people? When will their suffering end? huge question mark on that. Only time will tell. Second story of the day, ladies and gentlemen, concerns the latest situation as far as Ukraine is concerned. It is a developing story, and we are hearing and watching new events as they unfold in Ukraine. The latest being that Russia on Wednesday has said that military drills have ended and the soldiers are returning to their garrisons. How true is that? The US and the UK are still skeptical about this. This and more after the short report.
As tensions simmer in Ukraine, Russia is pulling back some of its troops from its border along Ukraine. Moscow's defense ministry issued a statement stating that troops are now leaving Crimea after finishing their military drills and were returning to their garrison, accompanied by images of military units crossing a bridge linking the Russian-controlled peninsula to the mainland. The German Chancellor to Moscow, Olaf Scholz, met with Russian President Vladimir Putin regarding Russia-Ukraine border issue and discussed willingness to continue addressing European security issues through dialogue. President Vladimir Putin hopes for a diplomatic solution to tensions with the US and its allies and announced a partial pullback of thousands of troops massed near the Ukrainian border. In an exchange with Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, televised, President Putin hints at readiness to continue diplomacy amid the Ukraine crisis. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged citizens to observe Day of Unity today to unite against Russian devastating assault. However, the US and NATO confirmed that Russia has massed some 130,000 troops near the border with Ukraine in preparation for a possible invasion. Despite claims by Russia, US President Joe Biden warns of possibilities of a Russian attack on Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg stated that so far there isn't any sign of de-escalation on the ground and Russia's military presence remains capable of an attack. The prospects of peaceful resolution remains skeptical as US is pulling their diplomats out of Kiev and ordering citizens to immediately get out of Ukraine.
Syed Muhammad Ali, Director Strategic Affairs, CAS, joins us here in the studios. Ali, thank you very much to have joined us. Ali, now that Russia is saying that it is withdrawing troops, the US does not believe that claims. It says the Americans haven't yet had the confirmation as far as that is concerned. The United Kingdom remains skeptical as well as far as that issue is concerned. Russia has been saying since day one that it does not want to invade Ukraine. The US and its allies have been saying since day one that Russia wants to invade Ukraine. Who should we believe?
Nobody. Thank you, Omar. I think there are four perspectives which are clearly evident in this crisis. The Russian leadership has repeatedly said that it does not want to attack Ukraine, which is obviously in contrast to what US and UK in particular are accusing Putin of wanting to do. The third perspective is from the Chinese, very interestingly, because they have clearly said that it seems that the US and the Western powers are excessively hyping the threat more than it deserves to be.
So what is the advantage that the US and the allies have in hyping this situation?
I think they perhaps on a grand strategic level want Russia to get entangled, and because that could lead, that would allow them to justify the imposition of sanctions and the disentanglement of the growing economic and energy interdependence between Western Europe and Russia. So they see it as an opportunity at the strategic level that the goodwill that Russia has built in the last 20 years with Western Europe, I think it's a good opportunity in case if there is very small kinetic exchange, not something at the national level or a large scale confrontation, then it will be a useful opportunity, objectively speaking, from the Western perspective, to justify the economic strangulation of Russia and also pressurizing Western Europe to review their energy and economic ties with Russia. But very interesting perspective is from the Ukraine itself, the leadership. Although they are calling for unity, but it is very important that they are very careful not to provoke the Russians. And they are keeping their options open. Although they are receiving significant and regular military equipment and weapons from the West, I think almost 54 C-17 flights have landed in the last 1 week.
But you know, this weaponization is extremely important as well as far as the strategic situation of the whole region is concerned. By weaponizing a country, a small country such as Ukraine, aren't you further deliberating upon a crisis-like situation, if not now, in the future?
I think it's very important. Ukraine is a complex chessboard. on which the great power politics between West and a resurgent Russia is playing out. Ideologically, culturally, although many observers say Ukraine is part of their near abroad or sphere of influence, but that is a grave underestimation of how closely the Russians value Ukraine. It's not just a strategic buffer between the two global powers, but also they see it as their backyard. And if somebody, it reminds on a conceptual level of a very similar situation that brought the world on the verge of Third World War, but that was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You would recall that when the Soviets deployed some missiles in Cuba, the Americans reacted diplomatically, militarily, and we were on the verge of a nuclear holocaust. Why? Because what they viewed Cuba as their backyard. So it's the proximity. If the Soviets had deployed the same missile somewhere else, it would not antagonize them so much or provoke them so much, because they saw Cuba as their backyard. Now the same situation is playing out here.
But Ukraine isn't US's backyard, is it?
No, it's the Russian backyard. So they are seeing it that they are becoming a bit concerned that the Western NATO alliance is inching close. They are deploying, it's sort of a very aggressive forward posture that although the American strategy, objectively speaking, is very smart as well. They are threatening economic sanctions. They are pressurizing and encouraging Western European countries to disentangle their energy and economic ties with Moscow.
Not to.
And they are weaponizing, heavily weaponizing Ukraine to make it security dependent. So all these three things, if you add it up, makes it a very worrying scenario for Putin. But on the other side, in the Western media and in terms of the narrative building, perhaps the overarching Western perspective is that Putin is the bad guy. So the only diplomatic or psychological assistance that Moscow is receiving is from China, that they are warning the West that they are, I think, overhyping the escalation, which indicates a growing strategic at the global level convergence between Beijing and Moscow in the days to come.
Speaking of strategic convergence, we are seeing on the one hand the convergence between Russia and China, on the other hand between the United States, the Eastern European countries. There's also the crisis in Eastern Ukraine that hasn't yet been solved as well. That is another thorny issue. Then there is the whole NATO issue. Ukraine wants to become a member of NATO. The West is backing it. Russia does not want it to become a member of NATO. NATO's defense ministers are meeting today and tomorrow. NATO forces might go to Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Romania. What's going to happen on the NATO front?
I think very important question, Omar. I think NATO, it's a very important moment in NATO's history because of the, recently the US issued a new version of its Indo-Pacific strategy, which seems to be written by an Indian from a Pakistani perspective, as if the Indians are the most important country in the world for the US. But this has disturbed the Western European allies of the US, that they see that the US interest and security commitment is increasing disproportionately towards Asia Pacific, which will translate into much lesser and reduced security commitment towards the security of Western Europe. So that forces...
Is that deliberate? Is that deliberate? That's this new strategy?
I think it's a global reposturing of the US military hard power, essentially, because the lion's share is in the Asia Pacific under the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. The second zone, which is most important, is Europe. And the third is Middle East. But gradually the US is reprioritizing the deployments of its strategic land, naval, air power around the world. So that is making huge effects in Middle East, in Asia Pacific, and also in the Western Europe, because it is having a very deep effects. In Asia Pacific, it is destabilizing South Asia, because that has allowed India to build up and acquire technology and gain status, which is destabilizing from Pakistan's perspective for South Asia. You look at Middle East, I think they have developed a new Quad 2.0, which involves US, Israel, UAE, and that further encourages Russia and China to build up Iran and other centers of power. In the Western Europe, the Europe is really, I think, the most complex situation, because Western Europe want to remain allied with the US, but they expect US to have a main security commitment towards Western Europe rather than other countries. In contrast, what Washington is demanding from Western European allies is that instead of just providing security to Western Europe, it is nudging and encouraging Western European countries to deploy their own security forces in Asia Pacific against China. So this is a huge paradox that the Western countries are facing, and they have to balance three contrasting interests. They want to maintain a US goodwill. They do not want to antagonize and provoke Russia too much, and they also do not want to commit too much of their resources against China as well.
But this is a very delicate balance. How are they going to do it? This is what I don't understand, because with this new Indo-Pacific policy of the US, where it is realigning its strategic partnerships with countries, with the Western Europe being put on one side more or less, don't you feel that it is going to also realign their interests towards maybe Russia, maybe China in the future? Is a new bloc in the making, and where does that leave the whole Ukraine situation?
Very important question. Just briefly, I was part of an interesting dialogue with the UK a few years ago, and I raised the same question with the former head of their nuclear policy, and I raised this point that Britain is maintaining a delicate balance in terms of its economic relations with both US and China. Around a few years ago, the exports that Britain had to China were almost at the same level as they had with the US. And I argued with the Americans that they need to be respectful of countries like Pakistan as well, that we also have a similar concern, that we do not want to, as our Prime Minister has recently said, be part of a bloc politics. We want a partnership based on issues with all emerging, resurgent and status quo powers, because we want to recover from this very hostile geopolitics towards a profitable, mutually beneficial geoeconomic era, and that discourages us from offering security commitment of one power, and that has also, because we have learned in the last 20 years we were a US ally in the war on terror, and it has cost us 80,000 lives and $150 billion in our economy and its damage. So it has made, I think, Pakistani strategic and diplomatic leadership wiser and more astute and skeptical about the commitment of great powers.
So does this leave a country like Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership, as far as you said it does not want to anger Russia on one hand, on the other hand it is strengthening its alliances with the US and the West, in case of any skirmish or not? What is going to be the US political relationship or strategic relationship with the West compared to with the East, and especially Russia and China?
I think it is not said very often on media, but let me frankly tell you, in great power politics, the real prize is regime change. The contest is that who wants to cultivate the existing leadership of Kiev on its side and use it as a proxy against the other power. That's the real contest. And in how it plays out, whether the current regime continues to survive despite a threat from Moscow, but also not overcommit itself from the US, because in the long term, in every crisis, the US is, and despite providing a lot of military hardware, US has not physically deployed any soldiers on the Ukrainian soil, and they are also mindful. Biden administration is mindful of the overarching consideration that they do not want a scenario in which two great powers which possess more than 90% of the world's nuclear arsenal engage in a direct hostility or crisis. That, I think, restraint in caution despite a geopolitical context is there, which gives us a hope that hopefully things will be managed.
Let's hope so, because Russia is saying that the troops are returning after the military exercises. But anyways, the US and UK are not reacting in the same vein, which leaves me with the cyber attacks that Ukraine is saying, not since now, since quite some time, and very lately it has again pointed the fingers at Russia behind the cyber attacks. Then you remember very well that there was a statement, quote unquote, that there might be that Russia might use a false flag operation to invade Ukraine as well. In the current scenario and in this current slight de-escalation of military troops, of these military drills, what do you feel is going to happen as far as this so-called false flag operation or cyber attacks are concerned? Are they going to go on? Not? Was this just hearsay?
I think there are 3 points. First, the Russians have denied these accusations, and it remains to be seen whether the West can prove actually that these attacks emanated from Russian soil or state institutions, number one. Second is that what will Russia gain? That is very important. And I think it's a game of strategic brinkmanship, which is very delicate but also carefully calibrated, because both powers have huge arsenals and huge policy options. Even if it took place, which I don't know, a cyber attack, it also will test the US credibility, because its own doctrine says that it has options for much graver punitive reactions. And if they do not carry out a credible response to a cyber attack, then that will also bring into question their security commitment towards their allies. If they want Ukraine to trust their security commitment, then Ukraine is also, like Pakistan in 1971, expecting US to do more than just provided weapons and leave it at the mercy of a huge military might of Moscow. So I'm sure they are also noticing that they are being indirectly provided weapons, but they are also being encouraged to fight on behalf of the US, so that Moscow can be lured into a trap which allows the Western alliance to impose sanctions on Moscow, reduce the Western dependence and goodwill with Moscow, and also economically and diplomatically isolate Russia. And I don't think Moscow is that unwise.
I don't think Moscow is that unwise either, and I would really like to see how the next couple of days are going to unfold, Ali, because the next couple of days, the next week is extremely important as far as this crisis is concerned. Thank you very much, Syed Muhammad Ali, Director of Strategic Affairs, CAS, to have joined us and to have talked to us about this emerging story, this developing story that is the conflict in Ukraine, the situation, the tension between the United States and Russia also over Ukraine, and the West and the East as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, another aspect of it before we go to our stories is that if there is some kind of an incursion, it could ripple across Africa and Asia. It could cause food crisis as well. This is what a lot of NGOs have been talking about as well. Food price spikes, revolutions if Ukrainian grain deliveries are disrupted. Well, another angle that we'll discuss later. Let's come to our next story, ladies and gentlemen. That concerns World Health Organization that has lauded Pakistan for administering 200 million vaccine doses of COVID-19. We know, we've been talking about it. The NCOC, Dr. Faisal Sultan, have been diligently working with the healthcare workers in order to provide people of Pakistan with the necessary vaccines, whether it be their first or second doses, whether it be their booster doses, or whether it be even day-to-day, door-to-door, these people who are going from door-to-door in different parts of Pakistan in order to administer the vaccines to the people of Pakistan. This is a whole movement that has gone so that the people of Pakistan can remain safe from this pandemic, and that is what has been acknowledged by by the World Health Organizations. And I think a lot of other organizations have also lauded Pakistan's efforts in this regard. And then let's come to Dr. Yasir Siddiq-led's team, whose invention could help foster clean energy initiatives to combat global warming. And for that, he has set 2 world records in solar cell technology. Now, he's a PhD scholar, ladies and gentlemen, at the Korea Institute of Energy Research and the University of Science and Technology in Daejeon in South Korea. He has designed and fabricated solution-processed copper indium sulfoselenide solar cells. Now, these are going to be extremely helpful, not only as far as the current situation of climate change is concerned, because they are going to provide clean energy, but they are going to use the solar energy and going to provide more energy than the previous solar cells that have been in fact made, and that is a huge development as far as Pakistan is concerned. Let's see, Pakistan has been quite prominent as far as scientific innovation and technology is concerned. This is just one of the many important examples. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to an end of today's newsroom. We'll see you inshallah tomorrow with news stories, segments that pertain to US and Pakistan. Stay safe, follow the SOPs and get yourselves vaccinated. Allah Hafiz.